It's great to be back in real England. I used to own a house in Severus Avenue for a long time when my wife was stationed at Imphal Barracks and I was in Hong Kong. And we always thought we'd settle in York, which is real England. And unfortunately for what I do, York was the wrong place to be, so we now live in the soft south. But that's why it's so nice to be back here. I'm going to leave the lights on because if I put them off, you'll all go to sleep. If I leave them on, you'll still go to sleep, but I shall see you and throw things at you. Usual health and safety things. If you hear the fire alarm, sit absolutely still till I have left, and then trample each other to death. The frocks and the brass hats. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, lay dying of pneumonia in his 60th year. He'd pacified England after the ravages of the Civil War. He'd brought law and order to Scotland and to Ireland. He'd embarked on a foreign policy that was popular with the public and which had made England a real power to be reckoned with in Europe. But not all was going as it should. He'd been offered the crown by Parliament, and he'd turned it down, not because, as he claimed, that having destroyed one monarchy, he wasn't going to create another. He'd have loved to have been king, but there was so much opposition from the army and from his family that he turned it down. But he had retained the right to nominate his successor. And he's dying, and he has not nominated his successor. Now, if he'd nominated Major General John Lambert, probably we'd still be a republic to this day. Major General Lambert was 41 years of age. He was fit, he was intelligent, he was robust, and he could have done the job. But he'd been one of the major opponents to Cromwell accepting the crown. He'd been very noisy about it, and he'd fallen out with Cromwell, had been stripped of all of his offices, and he was at home tending for his he'd bred sweet peas, apparently. And instead, Cromwell nominated his eldest son, Richard. Now, the trouble about Tumbledown Dick, as he was known, was A, he didn't want the job, B, he wasn't up to the job, C, he was massively in debt, and so was the country. And the economy, not for the first time or the last time, was in ruins, and the rudimentary banks weren't lending to the government. And there was a real risk that the country was going to collapse into anarchy again and another civil war between the extreme Republicans on one side and the unreconstructed divine right of kings supporters on the other. And Tumbledown Dick was simply incapable of recognizing or reconciling those two factions. And then enter General Monk. Monk had originally started off in the Dutch service. He was the nearest thing, I suppose, to a professional soldier that existed in the 1600s. He then fought for the king in the First Civil War, being captured by Parliament. 2 years in the Tower persuaded him to change his mind, and he became one of the best generals of the parliamentarians. And he became Cromwell's second in command, and in 1660 he was commanding the army in Scotland. And he came to the conclusion that the only way to prevent the country from collapsing into chaos was to restore the monarchy. And so on New Year's Day, 1660, he left with his regiment from his camp at Coldstream. He marched to London. He brushed aside a rather half-hearted attempt by General Lambert to defend the Republic, marched into London, packed Parliament with the dismissed royalist MPs and persuaded them to recall the monarch, and back came Charles II. Now, what he did, if you're a monarchist, as I am, although I'm sorry to say that my family fought on the wrong side in the Civil War. My family fought for Parliament, not the cause that I personally would have fought for. But that's irrelevant. Now, what he did was good, but of course it created huge suspicion of the army. Why is the army getting involved in politics? Why is the army interfering? And it gave rise to suspicion of the army, to questioning as to whether an army was legal. In peacetime, do you need an army? Should we have an army? Should an army be legal? And the result was, and the result to some extent is still with us today, because that distrust and suspicion of military interference in matters which are more properly the province of Parliament led to the legal basis on which the army exists, which initially were called the Articles of War, and then in 1712 they became the Mutiny Act, and then they became the Army Act, which we're all familiar with, and now more recently the Armed Services Act. Now the Army Act had to be passed every year, every 12 months until very recently. If Parliament didn't pass the Army Act, then the army technically ceased to exist. And we all used to think, how can we possibly delay passing of the Army Act or whatever? Wouldn't it be fun if we suddenly didn't exist? Fairly recently, the government brought the Army Act, the Naval Discipline Act, and the Royal Air Force Act together, and that is the Armed Services Act. That has to be passed every 5 years. If it isn't passed every 5 years, then the armed services technically cease to exist. Marlborough, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, one of our great soldiers, again the nearest thing, I suppose, to a professional soldier that existed in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. Family lost all their money in the Civil War. They were minor gentry. He became a page to the Duke of York, later King James II. The Duke of York took a shine to him, promoted him, ultimately commissioned him into the army, gave him well-paying sinecures, colonelcies of regiments, and all the rest of it. And by the time King James comes to the throne, James II comes to the throne, Marlborough, or John Churchill as he still is a lieutenant general. And then suddenly James, not in his dotage, but in his later years, he has a son. Now, people say the English hated Catholics. The English didn't hate Catholics. The English hated foreigners, which is not the same thing. Nobody minded that James was a Catholic. After all, his two immediate successors, his two daughters, one was married to William of Orange, who was Protestant, the other was married to George of Denmark, who was Protestant. So that wasn't a problem. And then suddenly, by Mary of Modena, his second wife, he has a son, Catholic. And that risks a Catholic succession and therefore a foreign succession. That's what they were worried about, foreign domination. Religion didn't bother people at all. It was the question that a Catholic king or Catholic succession might be foreign dominated. And by foreign, of course, we mean our traditional enemy, the French. And that's what got poor old James the bum's rush. And it was John Churchill who colluded with William, Dutch William, to bring him across in the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1660, of 1688, where King James is kicked out of the country. And that again leads to even more suspicion of the army. Here is the army interfering in matters more properly the province of the monarchy or Parliament. John Churchill, of course, said at the time that he did it for the protection, the defence of the Protestant religion, which I would suggest is a load of rubbish. He saw which way the wind was blowing. He saw where his personal advantage lay, and that's why he turned against the man who had given him everything. It was a disgraceful example of disloyalty. And the fact that when James was in exile, John Churchill still kept in contact with him, just in case the wind changed again, doesn't say a great deal for the man. That said, he was unquestionably a brilliant military commander. And when you think about it in British military history, to be a great British commander, you have to understand logistics. Because England and later Britain, and even today, we tend to fight our wars in undeveloped countries where logistics makes all the difference. So you have to understand logistics. And Marlborough did understand logistics, as indeed did Wellington, as indeed did Haig, as indeed, although I can't stand the man, did Montgomery. You have to understand logistics. And Marlborough was a brilliant logistician. He also understood the problems of dealing with allies, because not only do you have to be a good logistician, you've got to be able to operate in coalitions, because again, England, later Britain, tends to fight her wars as part of a coalition. We have a professional army. It's therefore expensive, therefore it's small, therefore we fight with allies. And you have to understand how to get on with difficult allies, and that was something that John Churchill, later Duke of Marlborough, did. He had terrible problems with the Dutch Estates General, but he knew he had to keep them on side. And that was one of his great strengths. Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, possibly our greatest general. Again, a man who understood logistics. He'd learnt his trade in India, the Third World. One of the first, probably the first military commander in India who was able to fight through the monsoon. He said, "What I need is bullocks. If I have bullocks, I have rice, and if I have rice, I have men." But he certainly got himself involved in politics. He sat in the Irish Parliament as a young man, and later on, of course, in the House of Lords. He knew the political limits within which he had to operate, which I think that's the difference, I think, between Wellesley, Wellington, and John Moore. John Moore probably was tactically every bit as good as Wellington. And while Wellington's men respected him, they didn't love him. Moore's men did love him. Moore was a much more approachable, much more personal character in many ways. But Moore could not get on with politics. Castlereagh said to him, if there had been anybody else available, you wouldn't have got the job. He couldn't get on with the Navy, despite the fact that his brother was a captain in the Navy. He couldn't get on with difficult allies. At one stage, he got arrested and locked up by the King of Sweden. Actually escaped through a lavatory window. So probably it was just as well that John Moore was left alone in his glory after the retreat to Corunna and his death at the Battle of Corunna. More up to date, perhaps, General Gordon, Charles Gordon. Charles Gordon was barking mad, I think. I mean, he was a Royal Engineer, mind you. But the man was bonkers. He spent his whole career mapping out extraordinary parts of the world that nobody had ever heard of, or leading extraordinary expeditions to extraordinary places, studying the scripture, and constantly falling out with his political and military superiors. He resigned, I think, 4 times in a fit of pique for one reason or another, because a politician had upset him or another general had upset him, and then tended to come back. But he did have a talent, unquestionably, of turning ragtag and bobtail Chinese and Egyptians into halfway decent soldiers. He, I suppose, got the sobriquet Chinese Gordon when he commanded the so-called ever-victorious army in one of those internecine and constant civil wars in China. He was terribly interested in finding he was a literal believer in the Bible. He believed that the Bible was literally true. And he spent years trying to find exactly where the Garden of Eden was. As far as Gordon was concerned, the Garden of Eden existed, it was on earth, and the question was, how did you work out where it was? And what he did was, he took the 3 rivers, the Euphrates, the Jordan, and the Tigris, and he said, right, before the flood, those rivers would have all started off in Eden. And he arrived at that conclusion by his reading of the Old Testament. So by extrapolating where those rivers flowed and pulling them back, he reckoned that they all joined, or would have joined, at an island called Praslin, which is about 800 miles probably north of Mauritius. So that, he reckoned, was where the Garden of Eden was. But he'd never been there. And when he heard that a chum of his was appointed as the Governor-General of Mauritius, he got hold of his chum and said, why don't we do a swap? And I'll go and be Governor-General of Mauritius. So off he went to Mauritius. And of course, being in Mauritius, it meant that he could go and look at this island and prove that it was actually the Garden of Eden. And what he felt that to prove that it was Eden, he'd have to discover the the tree of good and evil. Now, as far as Gordon was concerned, and again, by his reading of the Old Testament, good and evil were male and female. Good was male. He was male, so he would say it, I suppose. And evil was female. And the logic of that was that it was Eve who offered the apple to Adam. In other words, she was the temptress. The trouble was that Gordon, despite the fact that he was brought up with a whole lot of sisters, Gordon had no idea what female genitalia looked like, extraordinarily enough. And his ADC got rather concerned when he spent a whole afternoon, when he got to this island, chasing goats, female goats, because he wanted to see what female genitalia looked like. Extraordinary. I said he was bonkers. Well, when he got to Praslin, he found a thing called the coco de mer. And the coco de mer has two sorts of fruit. One is that one, and he thought, well, that's clearly male. And the other one is this one. So they're both fruit of the coco de mer. And that's obviously female. So there it is. This is Eden. There is the tree of good and evil. Male and female seeds on the same tree. And he gave a paper to the Royal Society on the very subject. And it just shows you the intellectual abilities of people of the time. The people actually came and listened to his theory as to why Praslin was the Garden of Eden. As I said, the man was totally monkers. Then in 1888, he was appointed as Governor General of the Sudan. And his instructions from the government were very clear. You are to go to the Sudan. There is a dervish rebellion going on. You are not to get involved in that rebellion. You are to evacuate all the Europeans and the Egyptians in the Sudan. You are to evacuate them to Egypt, and you are then to leave. Is that quite clear? Yes, indeed, said General Gordon. Off he went. His private agenda was that he wanted to put down slavery in the Sudan. Now, that's unquestionably a most laudable objective, but it was absolutely none of his business. And it wasn't what he'd been told to do. He'd been told to evacuate Egyptians and Europeans back to Egypt and then to leave. But of course he didn't. He didn't succeed in abolishing slavery either, because there were too many vested interests in it. But when he could very easily have got away, which he could have done, he didn't. He deliberately stayed. And then, of course, he got killed. Which is probably what he wanted. He probably wanted to die as a Christian martyr. Now, the picture at the top left there, it's a picture you'll all be very familiar with. That is how Victoriana saw General Gordon meeting his death, standing on the steps of his office, pistol in hand. More recent historical investigation indicates that actually the picture down the bottom right was possibly more accurate, in that he wasn't in the Governor General's office at all. He was actually on his way to a small Christian church through a back alley, and in a back street he was actually ambushed and killed. But in either way, he died, and poor old Gladstone's government got hell's stick from the muscular Christian tendency back home, who felt that the government hadn't done enough to go and rescue Gordon. Here's General Gordon, this great Christian gentleman, and he's been murdered by a whole lot of ragtag and bobtail. What are you, the government, doing about it? And the answer was the government weren't going to do very much, because they thought the chap was bonkers and probably thought they were quite well rid of him. 1899, George Nathaniel Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India. Curzon was brilliant, he was arrogant, he was incisive, tended to be inflexible. He had to be fair, usually justified, very high opinion of his own abilities. He did all he could for the Raj in India. He advanced the cause of the Raj, and to be fair to him, he very much advanced the cause of the people who were living there. He genuinely believed that the purpose of empire wasn't just to wasn't just aggrandizement of the British or making money for the British, it was to look after the citizens of the empire, something that had been laid down by Disraeli much earlier than that. So he's operating for the good of the inhabitants. And in 1902, he got, as the commander-in-chief of the army in India, General Viscount Kitchener. Now, the commander-in-chief of the army in India, that meant both the Indian Army, the British Indian Army, which was Indian regiments officered by British officers, and units of the British Army stationed in India. And the commander-in-chief commanded all of them. Kitchener, of course, was the hero of the Boer War, and he came out there determined to transform the Indian Army from really a colonial gendarmerie, now a very good colonial gendarmerie, a very efficient colonial gendarmerie, but he wanted to turn it into a modern army capable of being deployed anywhere, not just in the Far East or not just in India's near abroad. He embarked on a massive reorganization of the Indian Army. He established the Staff College, the Indian Staff College at Quetta. It's now the Staff College of the Pakistan Army. And as you go into it to this day, the first portrait you see is a huge portrait of Kitchener, because he's the man who established it. And he's working very, very hard to try and do that. But he fell out with Curzon. He didn't fall out with Curzon over his reorganizations. Curzon approved of his reorganizations of the army. Curzon approved of the fact that Kitchener was expanding the martial races of the Indian Army. Now, this was a great theory that probably had very little scientific backing to it. But the theory was that certain races were martial, certain races were military, they were good soldiers, and certain races weren't. So he felt that the Indian Army should have more and more of the martial races, by which he meant Rajputs, Dogras, Sikhs, Gorkhas, and less of the races that he thought were not martial, like Bengalis or Madrasis or whatever. Slightly unfair. My own view is that actually if you tell people long enough that they're martial, they probably will become martial. Although that said, I suppose one mustn't get too racial, but if you had to go over the top against a lot of very angry enemy, would you rather have half a dozen Spaniards behind you, or would you rather have 2 Sikhs and a Gurkha? I mean, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? There we go. There'll be another death threat, I suppose, in the post. So what they fell out about was that the system in India was that the military member of the Viceroy's Council, who was a Major General, and he was the sole military advice to the Viceroy. Kitchener is the Commander-in-Chief, and he's a full general, and he thinks that he should be the sole advisor to the Viceroy. He didn't think that a Major General should be advising the Viceroy direct. It should be done by him, the Commander-in-Chief. Now, today, I mean, you think of that, that makes total sense. After all, today, the sole military advisor to the government is the Chief of the Defence Staff. There isn't somebody else there as well, whispering in the ear of the Prime Minister. But Curzon liked the old system. He liked the idea that he could have an independent source of advice. He'd listen to the military member, the Major General, part of his council, and he would listen to Kitchener as well. He'd get 2 opinions, and he'd weigh them up and decide which one he wanted to go along with. Kitchener didn't like that, fully understandably. Both sides appealed to the home government. Both sides threatened to resign over it. Curzon said he'd resign if he didn't get his way. Kitchener said he would resign if he didn't get his way. The government took the view that it was easier to replace a viceroy than it was to replace the first soldier of empire. So it was Curzon who went. But again, it was another example of military politicking when maybe they shouldn't have been doing it. It's quite interesting to think that the modern convention which is where soldiers do not get involved in politics and do not make statements that could in any way be described as political, only dates from 1927. Up until 1927, serving soldiers were entitled to stand for election to Parliament, and if elected, to sit in Parliament while still being serving soldiers. And that stopped in 1927. It still exists for the Army Reserve, what was until very recently the TA. An officer of the Army Reserve is fully entitled to be a Member of Parliament. Very few of them are, or perhaps it's the other way around, perhaps very few members of Parliament join the Army Reserve, but nevertheless, they're perfectly entitled to it, which you may think is a bit odd because, all right, Army Reserve, they're not full-time, but nevertheless, they shouldn't, in my view, military people should not be political. You're there to serve whatever government is in power, however much you may dislike them. But that's the way the rule was. Now, coming up more to the period that I know you're most interested in, as you will know, in the years leading up to the First World War, the view of most English politicians and some generals was that if there was going to be a war in Europe, and increasingly it looks as if there was going to be, then Britain would have no part of it on land. They might do something at sea, but they would not get involved in land. A number of British officers, without telling the government, without the permission of the government or the knowledge of the government, started negotiations with the Belgian General Staff. And later on, with the French General Staff, led by Henry Wilson, who was then a Brigadier General and the Director of Military Operations. And it was the plan that they came up with, entirely independent of the government, without the knowledge of the government, without the permission of the government, that very much is one of the main factors leading to Britain, in fact, getting involved in the First World War on land, on the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, rather. There are other reasons as well, of course, but that was one of the major factors. Looking back on it now, of course, Wilson and his chums were right. If Britain hadn't become involved on land, France would probably have lost. Germany would probably have won the war, the land war, and a Europe dominated by Germany would not have been in the British interest. And one can only imagine that Britain might well have been the next domino to fall, and that maybe could have been a war that we might not have been able to win. After all, why has Germany, between 1907 and 1914, why has Germany launched 17 battleships? Why does Germany need a blue water navy? She hasn't got an empire to defend. She doesn't depend on overseas trade. Why does she need a navy? She could only need a blue water navy with all the expense and the effort and everything else if at some stage they're going to have a crack at the Royal Navy. So what Wilson and his friends did was, in hindsight, was right, but it was interference in a mammoth scale with matters that really soldiers should have had no part of. One of the officers who absolutely agreed with Wilson and what Wilson did was John French, who, of course, as you know, commands the British Expeditionary Force before handing over to Douglas Haig. Now, French himself was involved in the most massive piece of military blackmail. He was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, the professional head of the army, prior to 1914. And prior to 1914, the Irish Home Rule Bill was working its way through Parliament. Now, there had been a number of attempts to give Ireland home rule. They'd all failed. They'd all been chucked out, either by the Conservatives in the House of Commons or by the House of Lords. But this was one that, in 1914, was actually working its way through, and it was pretty clear it was going to go through. It was going to go through all the stages of the House of Commons. It was going to go through the House of Lords, and the King would sign it into law. I may say that that Home Rule Bill was designed to give Ireland slightly less power than the Scottish government has today. So it was a fairly mild form of autonomy, or semi-self-government, if you like. And perhaps if it had gone through, maybe the relationship between ourselves and Ireland might be might be a different one. But in any event, there were large numbers of the population of the north of Ireland, who of course were originally Scottish settlers planted there, both by James I, James II, and indeed before that by Elizabeth I, who did not wish to have any form of Irish self-government. There was a religious aspect to it. Most of the population of Ireland were Roman Catholics. The population of the north was very largely Protestant. And the two cultures were different. They still are, unfortunately. And the Ulster Protestants formed the Ulster Volunteers. Now, the Ulster Volunteers were an armed body. They wore uniform, they did drill, they had machine gun units, they even had some artillery. They were armed with, largely with German weapons, because the Germans were quite happy to arm anybody that inconvenienced the British. And they were commanded by retired British officers. Totally illegal. And their purpose was to fight any attempt by the British to give home rule to Ireland. What they said home rule is Rome rule, which of course was nonsense, but that was the great rallying cry. Now, of course, if that happens, an armed, illegal body resisting the government, then who's going to put it down? Well, clearly it's going to be the army. And a lot of people in the army objected to that. And the 3rd Cavalry Brigade, stationed at Dublin, the officers of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade said, should we be required to march against the Ulster Volunteers, we will all resign. And this went back to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, John French, who issued a statement saying, no, there'd been a misunderstanding. Absolutely terrible. Sorry, chaps. No question of the army being sent against their fellow religionists. This will not happen. That was a statement made without cabinet approval, which the government did not approve of, and the result is that John French was sacked as Chief of the Imperial General Staff. It didn't prevent him, of course, from being recalled to command the BEF, and it didn't prevent the eventual promotion of the commander of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade, Brigadier General Hubert Gough, who'd been one of the ones who said, I'll resign. Didn't stop him eventually becoming a full general. It's called the Curragh Mutiny. Technically, it wasn't a mutiny because the officers hadn't disobeyed direct orders. But nevertheless, it was disgraceful, frankly. It's not for officers or soldiers, particularly officers of a regular volunteer professional army, to decide against whom they must fight or against whom they must not fight. One of the great advantages, surely, of a professional army is you can use it against anybody, anywhere, which you can't do with a conscript army. We know, the most recent example we know from the Vietnam War, you cannot fight an unpopular war with a conscript army, whereas you can fight an unpopular war with a professional army. Take Iraq. Iraq was unpopular with most of the population. It didn't bother the army. The British army went into Iraq and did everything they were required to do. So the so-called Curragh Mutiny was a disgraceful example of soldiers trying to influence the politicians, which should not have happened. When war breaks out, the Liberal government had always been thought to being a bit sort of light on defence. They weren't terribly strong on defence. So to show that they did think making war was a serious business, they invite Kitchener to be the Secretary of State for War. Now, Kitchener didn't want the job. What Kitchener hoped to do was finish his tour in Egypt and then become Viceroy of India. But when it was pointed out to him that really for the good of the nation, they really needed him as Secretary of State for War, then he agreed to do it, provided that it was non-political, provided he was not required to associate himself with any particular political party, and provided he wasn't required to do anything which could be considered political. So he became the Secretary of State for War. That was generally very popular in the country, very popular indeed in the Empire. He himself had very little time for politicians. He thought they meddled in matters they didn't understand. He thought they were a security risk. He said, if I tell them anything, they'll go and tell their wives. Except for Lloyd George, he'll tell somebody else's wife. He and Lloyd George did not like each other. They were totally opposite characters. Lloyd George was devious, rather dishonest politician, very clever. Kitchener was a straightforward, a lot cleverer than people think, but he was a very straightforward, uncomplicated man, and the two simply did not get on. And there were a number of things that Kitchener really should not have got involved in. He got involved in a frightful row with Lloyd George over the question of Welsh chaplains. Now, the army took the view that you were either a Roman Catholic or a Church of England or a Jew or other denominations. Other denominations meaning Presbyterian, Methodist, and the like. And that was that. And Lloyd George said, no, we've got all sorts of Protestant sects in Wales, as they do. There's the Reformed Methodists, there's all sorts of various cults. And we want chaplains from those. And Kitchener said, absolutely no. Okay. OD, we already got them, other denominations, that's that. And that became a real spat. Got as far as cabinet. I mean, can you imagine? You'd have thought cabinet would have more important things to talk about than the question of Welsh chaplains. And Lloyd George keeps pushing it because he doesn't like Kitchener and he wants to undermine Kitchener. And Kitchener in the end loses, and they have to recruit all these extraordinary Welsh chaplains for the army. And then Lloyd George brought up the point of having a Welsh division. He said there are Irish divisions, in fact, there were two regular Irish divisions, and then there were the Ulster Volunteers who were absorbed into the British Army as the 36th Ulster Division. There were their corollary, Redmond's Volunteers, who'd been raised to fight the Ulster Volunteers. I mean, this is really an Irish, only the Irish could do it. And they became the 16th Irish Division. So you've got Irish divisions, you've got Scottish divisions. Why can't we have a Welsh division? And Kitchener wasn't keen. He took the view that Wales was generally pretty anti-military. Not that many of them joined. And was very anti having a Welsh division. But of course, eventually Lloyd George got his way. And actually, recruiting from Wales was just about the same as recruiting from everywhere else in the United Kingdom. So his fears that nobody would join, of course, was quite untrue. And the Welsh division actually turned out to be a perfectly good, workable division. But again, it's something that Kitchener really should not have got involved in. He should have just let, if that's what Lloyd George wants. Lloyd George was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Let him have it. And then, of course, the question of the Shells scandal. French was not above slipping stories to journalists with whom he was friendly. And he was particularly friendly with a man called Charles Court Repington. Repington was a journalist, a very clever journalist. Repington had been a lieutenant colonel in the army, and he had to leave the army basically because he couldn't keep his willy in his trousers. So he had to go. And he resented that. He resented being told to resign, because of actually being sacked, and was quite happy to stir the pot. So when French told him that the whole problem on the Western Front, that there weren't enough shells, and this was all Kitchener's fault because the system wasn't producing enough shells, this became what was known as the Shells scandal, stirred by Repington and seized on, of course, by Lloyd George as a way to weaken Kitchener. The fact is that it wasn't Kitchener's fault. The whole system of producing shells for the army was based on an army of 6 divisions fighting a war of the intensity of the South African War. That was the theory. People said, right, if there is a war, how intense will it be? Well, the last war we fought was the South African War. It'll be as intense as the South African War, and the army will never be more than 6 divisions. So we'll stockpile for that. So all the stockpiles, all the stores of reserve ammunition and reserve shells and everything else were based on that premise. Well, of course, the fighting on the Western Front, even during the period of John French, was far more intense than anything that had happened in the South African War. And the army was already more than 6 divisions strong. So Kitchener got the blame. this then led to the production of ammunition being taken away from Kitchener and given to Lloyd George, and Lloyd George became the Minister of Munitions. Now, the fact is that although there was a lot more fuss and feathers and PR once Lloyd George took over production of ammunition, he didn't produce any more or any better a system than Kitchener would have done. But it was another example of this antagonism between the two of them, that they just didn't like each other. I suppose the worst example, if you like, of political military falling out and interference in the First World War, of course, was the Gallipoli caper. Now, as you know, politicians in the First World War were really divided into what were known as the Easterners and the Westerners. And the Easterners, primarily Lloyd George and Churchill amongst them, felt that the Western Front the casualties of the Western Front were just unacceptable. We didn't seem to be achieving anything there. What you needed to do was to go for the props. And Lloyd George kept saying, knock away the props and Germany will fall. What he meant by the props were Austria, Turkey, and Bulgaria. The Westerners, on the other hand, said, no, the only way to win this war, expensive though it is to defeat the main enemy, Germany, in the main theatre, the Western Front. And anything else, anything that takes away from that is a waste of time and a waste of assets. And they failed, perhaps. I mean, Lloyd George and Churchill failed to take the point that the props, Germany was actually the prop. Austria, Bulgaria, and to a lesser extent, I suppose, Turkey, were kept in the war because of German money, German equipment, and German training. And in a funny way, if you remove them from the equation, Germany would actually be stronger. But that was the dichotomy. The people who believed, Lloyd George and Churchill amongst them, that actually, forget the Western Front, let's look for the softer option. And the Westerners who said, no, it's got to be the Western Front. Now, in 1915, the Russians, who of course Russia and Turkey were traditional enemies. One of the reasons that Turkey came into the war in the first place was because Russia was on the other side. And you remember, if you think back, that the Ottoman Empire at one time went all the way around the Black Sea. The only bit they didn't have was, funny enough, was Georgia, but it went all the way around the Black Sea. And successive Russian wars took various bits away from them. One is reminded that the Crimea, of which there's so much fuss at the moment, the Crimea was taken from the Ottoman Turks by Catherine the Great in 1783. And it was Russian from 1783 onwards. It was only in 1953 that, for convenience only, the Crimea was put into the Ukraine. It had been part of Russia. Looking at the map, the USSR government thought, well, actually, hang on, administratively, it's nearer the Ukraine, let's stick it into the Ukraine. And as the Ukraine was a Soviet Socialist Republic, it frankly didn't matter. And then in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, it all happened so quickly that Russia didn't have time, or perhaps it didn't occur to them, to negotiate the Crimea back into Russia. And the result was that, of course, it went independent with the Ukraine. And when the Russians woke up to it, of course, Putin was determined to have it back, and he got it back. But we should remember it was always Russian. However, in 1915, you've got all these Russian ports all around the north of the Black Sea, full of Russian ships, wanting to export their goods, mainly grain. That was one of Russia's major exports, was grain. And they couldn't because, of course, the Turks are controlling the Sea of Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, and the exit to the Mediterranean. Similarly, Russian ships couldn't get out with their goods, and Western resupply, artillery, ammunition, all the other things that you need to wage war, couldn't get in. So Churchill, who's this time First Lord of the Admiralty, the politician in charge of the Navy, says, well, what we could do is, why don't we get the Navy to force the Dardanelles, to force the Narrows? And if we do that, if we can force the Narrows, then we open up the Black Sea, and the Russians can export. The Russians can get their ships out into the Mediterranean, and we can get our stuff up to them. Kitchener went along with this reluctantly, but he went along with it because it was going to be purely a naval matter. It wasn't going to involve the army. It wasn't going to involve any troops. So he accepted that. And as we know, what actually happened, of course, is that the Navy are unable to force the Narrows due to a combination of minefields and Turkish forts along the shores. Any admiral who studied history would know that it is exceedingly difficult for a battleship with the gun going up and down to knock out a properly built fort on land. And they should have known that from thinking back to the Martello, or the original Martello Tower in Corsica, which took, I think, 3 British frigates something like 2 days before they finally knocked it out. And that only happened because they set it on fire. And that led, of course, to the Martello. People think this is a very good way of coastal defence. It leads to all the Martello towers being built along the coast of England. Anyway, the Navy having failed to cross it, Churchill then says, well, actually, what we could do is just land the army, and then the army can take out the forts, and then the Navy can sail up through the Dardanelles. Everybody was anti that. French commanding the BEF was anti that. There are no troops. Kitchener was anti it, but the Westerners, the Easterners rather, Lloyd George and Churchill have their way, and sure enough, troops are deployed. The initial 4 divisions, the Royal Navy Division, the Marine units knew what they were doing, the rest didn't. The Royal Naval Division, you'll remember, was a Churchill wheeze. When the Navy mobilizes, actually the Royal Navy was the biggest in the world, bar none. It was bigger than the next 3 biggest navies. It was enormous. So when it mobilized, of course, it had far more sailors than it actually had hammocks. Didn't need all these sailors. So chaps that joined to dance the hornpipe and drink rum, or whatever sailors do, find themselves given a helmet and a rifle and told you're going to be soldiers. So the dear old Royal Naval Division, yep, okay, they can go off to Gallipoli. Well, they didn't know what they were doing, half of them. The 29th Division, which was supposedly a regular British Army division, but actually had been cobbled together from units that had come from all over the world, garrisons coming in, put together, didn't really have time to train together, staff didn't know the commanders didn't really know the staff, they didn't really know what they were doing. And the Anzac Corps, 1 Australian division and 1 Australian-New Zealand division, wonderful material. Really, really good material, but totally inexperienced, untrained. None of them knew what they were doing. And the result, of course, is a total shambles. Ultimately, there are 400,000 Empire troops in the Gallipoli campaign. And they achieve the square root of bugger all, if I can use the expression. And of course, eventually, they have to be withdrawn. The one bit that works is when the Navy fulfill one of their traditional roles, which is removing a beaten army so that it can be used somewhere else. The only people who knew what they were doing was 29 Indian Infantry Brigade, which was 3 Gurkha battalions and a Sikh battalion. They were regulars, they knew what they were doing, but there weren't enough of them. One of the Gurkha battalions does eventually manage to capture Sari Bair. They get up onto this. Now, once you're up there, you dominate the whole area. And unfortunately, they were supposed to be then reinforced by a new army brigade who got lost, never turned up, and eventually they were shelled off it. Hamilton wrote a letter afterwards, which I've seen, which said, if only I had had more Gurkhas, I would never have been held up by the Turks. If he'd said, if only I'd had more troops who knew what they were doing, whether they were Gurkhas, Brits, Australians, or whatever, he'd never have been held up by the Turks. The fact is that the British could not maintain 2 major campaigns 1,300 miles apart. They simply couldn't. And the Western Front, of course, had to take the priority. So this, again, is an example of military political disagreements and not being able to think through the thing properly. Once the Navy had failed to force the Narrows, they should have cancelled the thing. They should have cancelled it altogether. They felt they couldn't. Face was involved. If we're seen to withdraw against an Asian enemy, what will this tell the subjects of the empire, and all the rest of it? So they couldn't do it. But they really should never have got involved in it in the first place. The result, of course, was Churchill, from being First Lord of the Admiralty, he's sacked. He's got to resign. And he says, I'm going back to my first love, the army. Churchill did go to Sandhurst and was commissioned into a gloriously caparisoned cavalry regiment. He never did any soldiering. He used his mother's influence to get himself to interesting places where he could write a good book. He went on, he was in the Spanish-American War for a bit, wrote a book about that, got himself attached to the wonderfully named General Sir Bindon Blood. What a wonderful name. General Sir Bindon Blood's Malakand expedition across the border into Afghanistan and the tribal territories. Wrote a very good book about that. Then got himself attached to Kitchener's war in the Sudan. And again, actually the book he wrote on that, and I think it's called The River War, it's actually still probably the best account of that particular campaign. Brilliant reporting. But he did no more. He never saw the inside of a barrack room or the outside of a soldier. He did no soldiering at all. And then, of course, left, stood as a candidate for Oldham to get into Parliament, failed, went off to South Africa, to the South African War as a reporter, joined the Imperial Horse. It was a militia outfit. He didn't actually do any soldiering with it, but it meant that technically he could wear uniform. Therefore, he was captured. He'd be treated as a prisoner of war. He was captured, if you recall, locked up with some others, and escaped under circumstances that are still somewhat dubious. There are those who say that he had agreed that when he got out, he'd wait for the others, and they say he didn't wait for them, he went. Others say that he behaved with great gallantry. Who says he behaved with great gallantry? Churchill himself, when he writes the account of it. Anyway, he said, I'm resigning, I'm going back to the army, and I would like to be Commander-in-Chief East Africa, please. And people said, you can't. What do you mean? You want to be a general? Yes. Well, you can't. Well, I want to command a brigade on the Western Front. John French said I could have a brigade. Well, John French might well have said he could have a brigade, but John French was no longer there. It's now Douglas Haig, and Douglas Haig is a much harder heart than John French. But he does agree that he can have command of a new army battalion, the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers, provided that he does a month attached to a battalion of the Grenadier Guards to learn what soldiering on the Western Front is all about. And in Churchill's book, he says very quickly, everyone is taking my advice. I was frequently asked to make decisions. The officers of the battalion generally bypassed the commanding officer and came to me. That's what he says in his book. If you trot along to Kew and get out the war diary of that particular battalion, Churchill gets mentioned twice. First, the day he joined, it said, a politician, a Mr. Churchill, joined the battalion. And on the day he leaves, a month later, it says, a politician, a Mr. Churchill, left the battalion. There are no orders signed by Churchill. There's no evidence at all that they ignored the commanding officer and went to him. They didn't. He then takes over command of the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers, which he does for 120 days, about 4 months. The battalion are in Plug Street Wood, or in the area of Plug Street Wood. In that entire period, they don't have a single man killed. And that's nothing to do with the tactical abilities of the commanding officer. It is because it was a very, very quiet area at the time. Churchill, in command, unashamedly uses the military communication system to keep in touch with what's going on in England. He's constantly going off on leave to sort of stir the political pot back in England. In one of his letters, he refers to the corps commander as an arrant villain. And the reason he calls the corps commander an arrant villain was that the corps commander insisted that if the battalion was in the trenches, then the commanding officer had to be there as well, which he didn't want to be. Eventually he leaves. Kitchener allows him to resign from the army, provided he gives a written assurance that he will never again apply for any military command, which he does. And he goes back to being a politician. the attempts, which we all know about, by politicians to frustrate Haig's prosecution of the war, you will not be surprised to believe that, to hear that I believe that Haig was the right man for the job, probably the only man capable of being able to do the job. Haig was not a technophobe. Haig will go for anything that'll save casualties. You've only got to read the letters that he writes about when he hears about the invention of tanks, what he thinks of that. He was absolutely the right man, but Lloyd George particularly did not like him. Lloyd George thought he was wasting manpower. And the attempts by Lloyd George and others to frustrate Haig's prosecution of the war, they sometimes take on what would be ludicrous if it wasn't that men's lives were at stake. The Salonika caper, that was a wheeze of Lloyd George, backed up by Churchill. Salonika, what on earth are you going to achieve in Salonika? It tied up 250,000 Allied troops. The only thing it seems to do, as far as I can see, is raise the VD rate amongst the French contingent, which went through the roof compared with their VD rate in France, which, if you've ever had a look at Mrs. Boris the Bulgar, is even more extraordinary. But there we go. It achieves absolutely nothing. But again, it's this business of the Easterners trying to find the easy way out, which simply didn't exist. Fortunately, Wally Robertson, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, the professional head of the army, is a solid supporter of Haig and is a very useful buttress bulwark between Haig commanding the army and running the war and Lloyd George in Parliament. But Wally is an extraordinary. It's not unbelievable because it happened. It certainly couldn't happen today, even. And it's quite extraordinary. I mean, he's born in 1860 in conditions of absolute poverty. Both his parents were illegitimate. His father made a sort of a living as a assistant postmaster in a village and doing a bit of tailoring on the side. Robertson himself left school at 13, went into domestic service, and then joined the army when he was 17. He joined the 16th Lancers. In 10 years in the ranks, he was a troop sergeant major by 1888. Troop sergeant major is the equivalent of a staff sergeant today, and was commissioned. His commanding officer thought, this is a bright boy. And they commissioned him as an ensign. He was an extraordinary linguist. He spoke 6 Indian languages and French and German fluently. I mean, he was one of these people. He was self-educated. He read and read and read and read, constantly reading, constantly improving his building on the very rudimentary education that he'd had in the village school. He spent most of his time on the intelligence staff in various parts of the world. He did marry a lieutenant general's daughter, which probably would have helped, I suppose, a bit. But he went to the staff. He's the first ex-ranker, to have gone to the staff college as a student. He was there with Haig and with Allenby. He's a colonel in 1903. He was actually the youngest colonel in the army in 1903. He was aged 43. By 1910, he's a major general. He has commanded the staff college. Not only the first ranker to go as a student, but he's commanded the staff college as well. He was the quartermaster general of the BEF during the retreat from Mons. Very largely thanks to him that the retreat from Mons was successful, if any retreat can be called successful. In other words, that the army got back in one bet, because he had, long before it, he'd thought to himself, it's quite likely that we will have to retreat. It's quite likely that the French will have to retire against this huge German onslaught coming at them. And if the French have to retire, we will have to retire as well. And he'd planted these depots all the way back, what he thought would be the probable line of retreat. Depots of stacks of ammunition, stacks of food, stacks of water, stacks of medical supplies, and all the rest of it. So very largely due to Wally, that the retreat from Mons wasn't more bloody than it actually was. He then becomes chief of staff of the BEF, and eventually, of course, he becomes chief of the Imperial General Staff, having never commanded troops. He never commanded troops, never commanded a battalion, never commanded a brigade, never commanded a division. All his promotion was on the staff, and he was a highly competent staff officer. He was brusque to the point of rudeness. He never lost his accent. he distrusted politicians. He would listen to them, politicians declaiming, and he'd say, "I've heard different," and that would be that. He's often quoted when poor old General Horace Smith Dorrien got the sack for falling out with John French. Smith Dorrien, if you're cleverer than your superior, never let your superior find that out. And Smith Dorrien was considerably cleverer than John French. And Smith Dorrien suggested that instead of holding on to the Ypres salient, he said, what is the point of holding on to the Ypres salient? It's flat, it's miserable, it's stuck out. Why don't we pull back and defend along the Mont des Cats? Now, I don't know if you've been on the Mont des Cats, but it's a hill feature. It's quite easy to defend. And of course, militarily, that made absolute sense. Politically, totally unacceptable, because the only bit of Belgium that wasn't in German hands, of course, was Ypres. So Smith Dorrien has to be sacked. Woolley is sent along to sack him, and apparently had him in and said, "Horace, you're for Rome." And that was that. But at one stage, looking at his correspondence, and not only had he educated himself, he wrote exceedingly well as well. But at one stage, he writes in exasperation to the Lord Privy Seal, Lord Curzon, and I quote the letter. It said, "It would be valuable if you would kindly explain to the Prime Minister what the nature of the Balkan country is. He seems quite unable to envisage it and to understand the difficulty in getting heavy artillery forward and in supplying an army. In particular, he seems to think that there is a single line of hills between the Salonika force and Sofia, capital of Serbia, whereas the whole country is a mass of mountains. The country is, in short, one where a small army would be murdered and a large army would starve. It is of a highly defensible nature, and no amount of argument will alter that." So he's getting increasingly frustrated with political interference. I suppose perhaps the worst example of treating a military commander in a way that no military commander should ever be treated by his political masters was in December 1917. General Headquarters of the BEF produced an intelligence summary. And what they said is, with the collapse of the Eastern Front, and the Eastern Front, in fact, collapsed, they hadn't yet signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but it was clear that Russia was out of the war to all practical purposes. With that, the Germans will be able to move divisions from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. They will, we think, mount an offensive. It'll be their last chance to possibly win the war, and we think that that will happen in March 1918. Lloyd George refused to believe it. He said, no, the German army is done with. They cannot possibly mount any form of offensive in March or anywhere else. And he would not send out large quantities of infantry who were sitting around in England. And the BEF wanted them. The BEF said, look, we need these reinforcements, send them out. And Lloyd George wouldn't. He said, no, this is Haig again, simply wants to waste more manpower. There is no question of the Germans mounting an offensive. Not only can he not have the men, but Lloyd George then agreed with Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, without consulting the army at all, to take on more frontage from the French. Well, the result for Haig was that he's got to take on more frontage. He's not getting any reinforcements, so he has to reduce his divisions from 12 battalions to 9. So instead of 3 brigades in a division, each brigade having 4 battalions, each brigade now only has 3 battalions. And the result, therefore, is that he's got to cover more ground with less men. And of course, when the Kaiserschlacht comes in March 1918, the elastic stretches and stretches and stretches, but it never breaks. And the BEF actually fought the German army to a standstill. There are letters which are you can see and read them in Potsdam in Germany, where German officers are writing, I never thought I could see German soldiers disobeying orders. I never thought I could see German soldiers drunk on duty. What had happened was that, well, 2 things had happened. First of all, the Bolshevik weevil had got into some of the soldiers on the Eastern Front who were swapped to the Western Front. And instead of being told, right, you've got a bit of a rest now, they're sent straight from the Eastern Front into divisions on the Western Front, and released prisoners of war who had been in Russian prison camps were sent out onto the Western Front. And some of them had been turned Bolshevik. So there is a certain amount of Bolshevism or communism being spread in parts of the German army. And also the Germans were told, right, this is the final offensive. The British are starving. One more push, the British are out of the war. And then they roll over, particularly in Albert. They capture Albert, and they come across British depots, food items that they haven't seen in 2 years. They come across rum depots and all this sort of thing, and discipline starts to break down. The Germans, the most disciplined army in the world, German officers were horrified. At home, of course, the opposition and the press are blaming the politicians for not reinforcing the army, and the politicians, of course, are blaming the army for not stopping the offensive quickly enough. And probably the worst case of that is poor old General Morris, General Sir Frederick Morris, who was the Director of Military Operations, and he was due to go off to the Western Front, probably to be Chief of Staff of an army, and he listens to a speech made by Lord George. Lord George said in the House of Commons, he said, the British Expeditionary Force was considerably stronger in January 1918 than it was in January 1917. Now, in numbers alone, yes, he was correct. In February 1917, the British Expeditionary Force was 1,533,000 men strong. In February 1918, it was 1,751,000 strong. So on the face of it, in 1918, the BEF had 218,000 troops more than it had in 1917. So Lloyd George is correct. However, what he didn't say was that 1918 figure included 335,500 soldiers or men of the Labour Corps, which didn't exist in 1917. Now, the Labour Corps were largely Chinese, Chinese and Indians. Now, a Chinese coolie with a shovel is a splendid fellow, but he's not the same as a soldier with a Lewis gun. So in terms of operational soldiers, the BAF was actually considerably smaller. It was 118,000 smaller than it had been in 1917. So Morris wrote to the papers saying, actually, what Lloyd George said is not absolutely quite correct. Here are the correct figures. And Morris was sacked. Lloyd George later admitted that what he'd done, but he said that was a perfectly acceptable political ruse. It certainly wasn't seen as acceptable by the army. Relations were just as bad in the Second World War. If Winston Churchill was the man who won the war, as the 1945 election posters said he did, then I would contend that by his actions in office up to 1930, and with his constant interference in matters that he didn't understand, and his constant sacking of people, sacking of commanders who wouldn't tell him what he wanted to hear, and by his constant search for the easy option, he was a man who was very nearly responsible for us losing it. Now, in November 2003, the BBC had a competition, the greatest ever Englishman, and it was won by Winston Churchill. Now, when you think that John Lennon and Diana, Princess of Wales, were also in the frame, and there was no mention of Henry V, Alfred the Great, Elizabeth I, Duke of Wellington, it does give you an idea of the intellectual capacity of the people doing the voting. But nevertheless, it does prove that if you're a persuasive orator, if you can write well, if you can get your version of history out before anybody else, if you can bluster and bullshit, then you'll get to the top. I mean, there's hope for us all. It might be worth reminding ourselves of what Churchill was up to from the end of the First World War until 1930. After 1930, he's out of office until he's recalled in 1939. 1919, he's in the cabinet when they introduced the 10-year rule. Now, the 10-year rule, it was Lloyd George's idea, but it was backed up by Churchill. There will never be a war for 10 years. Therefore, there will not be a major war for 10 years. Therefore, you need not prepare for one. And it's 10 years from today, it's 10 years from tomorrow, it's 10 years from the day after tomorrow, and so on and so on and so on. And Churchill backed that up. 1921, he argues for battleships against aircraft carriers. The thinking admirals have said, look, the battleship is obsolete. The capital ship of tomorrow is the aircraft carrier. What we need is aircraft carriers. And the plan, the naval plan, was to build 8 aircraft carriers. Actually, by 1938. They never got built, needless to say. 1925, Churchill opposes construction of defences at the Singapore naval base. Going on a bit, when he becomes Prime Minister, something like a week before the Japanese actually invaded Hong Kong, Malaya, Philippines and everywhere else, Churchill in a speech said, "It is inconceivable that in my lifetime, or in the lifetime of my children, that the Japanese can ever produce a threat to the British Empire in the Far East." I mean, how wrong could he possibly be? 1927, cuts in the naval estimates. He's Chancellor of the Exchequer by then. Cuts in the naval estimates. 1928 insists that the 10-year rule is extended indefinitely as a rolling assumption. So even by 1928, there'll be no war for 10 years, no war for 10 years, etc. 1929, forces cuts in the army estimates. 1930, the army wanted more tanks. He says no. Now, from 1930, he's then out of office. And it was a bit of a cheek, I think, for Churchill to castigate Chamberlain's government for Britain's unpreparedness, when in fact Chamberlain was the first politician in office to propose rearmament. Chamberlain wanted to fight the 1935 election on a platform of rearmament. Prime Minister Baldwin said no because he thought it would be unacceptable to the Labour members of the coalition government. It was a coalition government at that time. So when war broke out in 1939, Churchill, of course, is recalled as First Lord of the Admiralty, and according to Churchill, a joyous signal went round the fleet saying, "Winston's back." Nobody has ever been able to find that signal. Richard Holmes spent ages trying to find it. And I sort of took that one and I tried to find it. It's not in any ship's logbook. It's not in any of the Admiralty records. If it existed at all, my old uncle who was in the Navy said if it existed at all, it was "Winston's back, oh shit," as opposed to "Winston's back." Anyway, nobody's ever been able to find the signal, and I would suspect that it never actually went round. When the Norway crisis happened, there were perfectly good plans for dealing with the German invasion of Norway. Churchill, in fact, sat around in the Admiralty Operations Office, personally directing the movements of individual ships, ignoring perfectly good, previously thought-out plans. And of course, the result of the total, if you want to study how not to run a military campaign, look at Norway 1940. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Total cock-up everywhere. Largely thanks to Churchill, who appoints people into command appointments, some of them who haven't had a command appointment for 10 years. You know, they've been retired, and he brings them back. You know, looking after old chums, and it doesn't work. And the result, of course, is there a frightful hurrush in Parliament. Chamberlain has to resign, and the very man who caused the cock-up in the first place, Winston Churchill, of course, is elevated into being the Prime Minister. Of course, it didn't stop with Norway. He's constantly bombarding the BEF with totally impractical suggestions. When the Germans do embark on the Battle of France, Calais is actually cut off. The Germans are ignoring Calais. They're heading for the north coast. And in Calais, there are two regular battalions, two regular motorised battalions. We didn't have many of those. And a very good territorial army battalion. There weren't many of those either. So 3 good battalions. And it was agreed by everybody there's actually no point in them staying there. Germans aren't attacking it. So the Navy sent ships to remove them. Churchill hears about it and sends a signal to Brigadier Nicholson, who's the garrison commander of Calais, saying, "No, no, no! The eyes of the Empire on Calais!" The Empire couldn't have spelt Calais, never knowing where it was, with the slightest interest in Calais. You ought to stay and you have to fight. And the result, of course, was that 3 battalions, which we could ill afford, went into the bag and stayed there for 5 years. He sacked the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, John Dill. Now, John Dill was that rarity. He was an intellectual soldier. Now, soldiering's not a cerebral profession, otherwise none of us would be in it, probably. But Dill was a very bright man indeed. And Churchill would come out with, said, let us invade Schleswig-Holstein. And Dill said, actually, have a look at the map, Prime Minister. If you do that, the Germans will still be cut off. What's the point? Oh, right. Well, let us invade Sardinia. Prime Minister, let's get a map out. What would be the point of invading Sardinia in 1940, 1941? So Churchill wants to get rid of Dill, because Dill is constantly putting a damper on all his bright ideas. So Churchill is not only the Prime Minister, he's also the Minister of Defence. And he brings in a new rule, which says that the Chief of the Imperial General Staff must retire at the age of 60. And Dill was going to be 60 at Christmas, so Dill had to resign. The fact that Churchill at the same time was 67 was immaterial. He's replaced, of course, by Alan Brooke, who does, up to a point, manage to keep Churchill under control, but not with any great success sometimes. Churchill, he sacks Wavell because he won't tell him what he wants to hear. He sacks Auchinleck, and he brings in the national treasure, Montgomery. It actually pains me to say it as a soldier. I mean, I spent all my life in the army. I love the army. I joined it when I was 17 3/4. I left it when they kicked me out at 55 1/2. But the British Army didn't win World War II. The Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force prevented us from losing it. And I would maintain that Britain's greatest contribution to victory in the Second World War was in not losing it in 1940-41. And I don't think that was any great thanks to Churchill, who, for all his wonderful and inspiring oratory, and it was wonderful and inspiring oratory, and although it may not have made a huge amount of difference in England, because the Brits are pretty cynical about oratory, but it made a huge difference in the neutral countries. Britain was not going to leave the war, Britain was still in the war. And the only neutral country that mattered, which of course was the United States of America. And the other great contribution he did make was in knowing right from the beginning that we had to get America into the war. We had to get America on side. Not just because of American industry, where we could lay contracts for all sorts of material, but ultimately getting Germany into the war. So what about today? Well, there's been much fuss and feathers generated because of some of the things that the generals have said, either serving or retired officers. And they're accused of frequently of straying into the political arena and behaving in an unconstitutional manner. General Sir Mike Jackson, who is an extraordinary man. I have never met anyone who can drink large whiskies all night and still be absolutely on the ball in the morning. Night after night after night after night. He's quite extraordinary, man. Quite extraordinary. We were all surprised when he became CGS, because he did have a habit of telling politicians to, in words that rhyme with truck and cough. But he did. Now, he got into terrible trouble because he reorganized the infantry. And what he did was he turned a whole lot of single battalion and pretty inflexible and frankly expensive battalions into large regiments with 3 or 4 battalions who were big enough structurally to cope with modern warfare. And he also did away with the arms plot. Now, the arms plot meant that every 3 years a battalion uprooted everything, kit, weapons, men, wives, polo ponies, the lot, and moved to somewhere else. And he replaced that with trickle posting. He hasn't got the system completely through, but that's the principle of it. That's what they were trying to do. And he came in for terrible flack because he reduced the army by 4 infantry battalions. However, in logic, during the arms plot system, where battalions moved every 3 years, 20% of the infantry at any one time were not available for operations because they were either just about to move, just had moved, or were on the move. So if you abolish the arms plot and replace it by trickle posting, where the battalions remain where they are and you trickle men through them. The chap would spend 3 years in the 1st Battalion in Cyprus, 3 years in the 2nd Battalion in Germany, 3 years in the 3rd Battalion in Scotland, or whatever. Then you can reduce the number of infantry battalions by 4. And what he was told, remember, by the government was that he had to reduce the size of the army. General Sir Richard Sheriff said, and he's right, he said the treatment of wounded soldiers brought back to the UK is a disgrace. And he was talking about when he was commanding the multinational division, effectively a British division in Iraq. And he's right. The successive governments, both as bad as the other, have destroyed the Royal Army Medical Corps. They've abolished all military hospitals. And while I would accept that probably the armed forces now are probably not big enough to have their own dedicated hospital, what is needed is a number of military wards manned by military and for military patients in National Health Service hospitals. Because believe me, and I've seen it, you take a man who's been shot up, you stick him in an ordinary public ward with a whole lot of people who don't understand him. He doesn't understand them. Quite a few of them are probably anti-war anyway. And it just, it doesn't work. You want to stick him with a whole lot of other soldiers. And Sheriff got into terrible trouble because he was told he was being political. And we'll remember the last reorganisation, which was sort of followed on from General Mike Jackson's reorganisation, where the Scottish regiments spent a huge amount of money. All the officers of Scottish regiments had to put their hands in their pockets to mount a Save Our Scottish Regiments campaign. Now, there's no question that the Scots are good soldiers. The Scottish regiments have got a fine tradition of soldiering, go back hundreds of years. But in recent years, certainly for the last 20 years, 25 years, the Scottish division has been the worst recruited division in the army. They cannot recruit. And the reason, of course, is that in the days when there was nothing else for Scotsmen, they joined the army. And then along came oil and then gas and various other industries, 7,000 jobs in Fastlane with a nuclear lot for a start. They don't need to join the army, and they don't. But there was and we've all, some of you may remember this lad carrying this placard saying, "I want to join my granddad's regiment." The trouble is he won't, because they are very poorly recruited, which is rather a shame. But it does mean they spent an awful lot of money, and they still got reorganised. In other words, all the Scottish regiments were amalgamated into one, the Royal Regiment of Scotland, with I think 4 or 5 battalions. Richard Dannett, for example, another CGS, he got into trouble for saying that the post-war activities in Iraq were not necessarily being conducted properly. Well, nobody could doubt that. The war fighting bit was brilliant. But the peacemaking was the one that failed. And you could say the same thing applies in Afghanistan. The war-fighting bit, brilliant. It's post the war fighting where things start to go wrong. I remember David Richards telling me that I knew General Sir David Richards, who was the Chief of the Defence Staff. I knew him when he was in Hong Kong as a captain, so I sort of know him reasonably well. And he was telling me that he'd told Prime Minister Cameron that the only way to sort out Afghanistan was to run it as a colony. You put in your own district officers, you put in your own judges, your own police chiefs, etc., 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 and it'll take 50 years. And clearly no government is going to spend the time or the money or the assets to do that. But that, he thought, and I think he's absolutely right, was the only way to deal with it. So, despite military attempts, overt and covert, to influence government policy, I think the generals would all accept that it is for the politicians to decide upon war or peace. And the politicians having made the decision, then the generals would very much like them to leave the waging of it to those who've spent their whole life preparing for it and are trained to do it. I don't know who said war is too important to be left to the generals. I bet it was a politician. It's a bit like saying that heart surgery is too important to be left to surgeons, or flying a plane is too important to be left to the pilots. It's utter bollocks, isn't it? I mean, excuse the language. It's nonsense. So politicians tell us what to do, but don't tell us how to do it. I think that's really what the military would think. Should soldiers make public statements which impinge on the political? Well, as I've tried to show, they always have. Should politicians poke their noses into military matters of a campaign, military conduct of a campaign? Well, they always will. Soldiers, I think, have to make their voice felt in some ways, because if they don't, nothing will be done. I mean, except in wartime, which is when it's too late, there are no votes in defence. There never have been. The electorate will say, yes, we support our boys. Oh, yes, we think the armed forces are great. But when it's a choice between another 100 tanks or tuppence off the income tax, you know which way people will vote. And the ideal is well-funded, well-equipped, balanced armed services, left to get on with what they know how to do and what they know best, but still under democratic control. I don't think we're too far away from that happy situation, but I do fear that with the increasing remoteness of war, with all its nastiness, and it is nasty, from the population, there's an increasing insistence that things like human rights, gender, disability, race, health and safety, employment regulations and everything else, there's increasing tendency for those to be imposed upon the military in the same way as they're imposed on everybody else. Missing perhaps the point that what the military do is not the same as what everybody else does. And if you do insist on imposing those laws on the military as well, all it does is makes it more and more difficult for the military, in some cases almost impossible for the military, to do the things that you, the public, and the government want them to do. But maybe it's always been like that. Thank you very much for listening. I've gone rather over time, I'm afraid.
So kick it off and tears.